you're traveling down the freeway 200K, maybe 250K, right? And then you're like, okay, I'm hungry. I'm going to turn off this intersection, this junction here. And you do a Scandinavian flick. You're on the e-brake, clutch in, you're steering off the intersection, you're dropping a couple of gears into the next roundabout. You jump over the roundabout, load the car up, still sliding, pop another gears down, and then you slide into McDonald's drive-thru. That's really what it is.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we've got Fredric Aasbø joining us all the way from his home in Norway. Now, Fredric, if you aren't aware of who he is, he's best known for driving sideways at very high speed. He is the winningest driver in history of Formula D in the US. Now, drifting at a professional level is something that is incredibly difficult to break into. So we talked to Fredric about his process of how he went from racing karts to racing basically grassroots drifting in Norway or in Europe in general, and then making that bold move to the US. And it's really easy to look at someone with the success of Fredric and think that they basically got everything handed to them on a platter. And as we go through this interview, you're going to find that's simply not the case. Fredric has worked incredibly hard, and no doubt he's also incredibly talented, but it's that combination of talent and hard work that has got him the success that he's seen to date. Interestingly, with Fredric, though, he has seen some success in some rather unique vehicles. In particular, he is sponsored by Toyota, and he ran both the Scion TC and also then the Toyota Corolla. Now, these are better known as entry-level, cheap, run-around, front-wheel drive cars, not something you generally see in professional drifting. Obviously, a lot of modifications went into that, but the interesting part, other than the conversion to rear-wheel drive, is that when everyone else is using big capacity V8s, 2JZs, etc., making 800, 900, maybe 1,000 horsepower, Fredric was doing all of that with a 2.7 litre four-cylinder. So we talked to Fredric about the pros and cons of competing with a small capacity four-cylinder engine, the reliability and the maintenance that went into that. Also, really interesting conversation within this podcast about the sort of setup changes that a professional drifter uses to dial the car in to the track. Now, before we get into the interview, just a quick introduction for those who maybe don't know what High Performance Academy is. We are an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune, how to build engines, how to wire race cars, and also relevant to today's topic, we also cover driver education, race driver education, and race car alignment and setup. Now, in particular, relevant to today's podcast, two of our courses that you may find interesting are our motorsport wheel alignment course. It will teach you how to align your race car or your street car if you're taking it to track days, and also our race driver fundamentals course, which will teach you some of the mindset and skills that you're going to need if you want to be successful out on the racetrack. And you'll find those courses at hpacademy.com/courses. We'll give you some links to those courses in the show notes. And as a bonus, you can use the coupon code podcast75. That will give you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. All right, let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Fredric. Thanks for joining us here today. You've got a fairly long and illustrious career in drifting, I believe the most winningest driver in Formula D. But before you got to drifting, you grew up, from what I understand, in Norway. And one of the things we see, maybe not so much in drifting, but in world rallying, is a lot of the most successful drivers come from Scandinavia. What is it about growing up in those countries that makes people so good at going sideways?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. This is cool. It's cool to get to keep meeting like-minded people like yourself. And from what I understand, we're going to be able to get quite technical today. And
absolutely.
I think, back to your question, growing up here, being able to drive in tricky conditions is kind of a part of life. For me, it was my grandma that taught me how to rip the e-brake. I remember coming into a turn, she was understeering, and just casually ripped the e-brake to, kind of set the car up into a little bit of a slide and throttled out of it. So it's kind of, it's just something that comes with how we're brought up here, like the snow, and it's really common here to have a project car or some kind of race car in your garage. Back in the early 2000s, the Norway and Sweden and Denmark got flooded with Japanese, sports cars. So there's a lot of car culture here. The speed hunters phenomenon. We have track days of 40,000 people, which is significant when you're a country of only 5 million people. So it's really a really deeply anchored, way of life. And, the Finnish rally drivers were probably the best, but us Norwegians, we have a couple decent ones too.
Now, is there anything, just to sort of go deep into how you're brought up over there, is there anything different or special that you're taught when you're actually learning to drive, or is it just relying on your grandma to teach you how to pull the e-brake?
I think for your driving test, you have to do what we call it's an elk or a moose maneuver.
Sure.
So it's basically, they have these wet tracks or oily steel-plated courses that you run in the summer. Obviously, in the winter, you do it in ice, where you have these like obstacles come out. So it's a thing that everyone needs to learn. I think that art is it's a little bit lost on the new generation of kids growing up, but it's definitely a pretty thorough way of learning to deal with the elements. We have vastly different tires for different locations. Some areas in Norway will have a lot of sheet ice. Other areas will be just wet, in the winter. But it's that understanding of studded tires versus non-studded tires and being able to deal with the elements. It's really comprehensive, especially compared to what I see in the US, where I remember when I got my California license, it was like $50 and just show us how you do a curb parking, like it's
focus on the important stuff.
Exactly. Drive through.
Yeah, I mean here in Queenstown we have snow on the ground maybe, if we're lucky, 3 times a year, and people lose their mind because no one knows how to drive. But of course, our cars are not running on studded or even winter tires, so it goes with the territory. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your progress from ripping the e-brake with grandma to actually getting involved in drifting. I understand rallycross ran in your family, so motorsport was not sort of anything particularly new to you.
Yeah, so my dad was into grassroots rally and rallycross, and he was a typical example of a guy that had the drive and the ambition, but he had 2 kids and a wife to feed and didn't have the time or really the funding to do it. And, growing up, I didn't see my dad a lot because he was working all the time. And as I think when I turned 12, he had a little bit of money. He felt really bad for not having spent time with me, so we ended up going go-karting. And I was absolutely terrible at first, especially. I was kind of like one of those little bit sheltered and scared kids, and eventually got a little more hang of the go-karting and realized I was quite tall. So I struggled with too much grip in the dry, but in the wet, I did a lot better. And eventually started learning more and more car control, and we got a couple of wins, and we were competing in the toughest class. And go-karting is such a good, it's the best school for learning how to race, because you get penalized so heavily for each mistake you make. And it's something that's really helped me in the years past. Like, I have this built-in sense of speed and that internal hustle, that you get from being a go-kart racer, where you're really trying to avoid any kind of mistake. So being brought up through go-karting, then discovering drifting and in fact the New Zealand scene back in like 05, 06 with Fanga Dan and when Mike started, I guess Mike became a part of it a little bit later, but that whole scene and actually dreaming of going to New Zealand to compete eventually, that was on my bucket list. Still is, honestly. But
we're still
right here. And I can't believe I haven't visited yet, but that's one day I'll come and see you guys. But discovering drifting out of Japan and eventually building a basic drift cars with my buddy and starting to compete here in Northern Europe when drifting was in its infancy, I got really lucky with my timing, coming off of the go-kart stint and now being able to get into drifting and spend my scholarship for school. And that was enough to basically build a basic car that would hang in that championship. The timing was great. And I was able to kind of grow with the sport here. And then that, coupled with some bigger ambitions, was what led me to the rest of the career.
All right, so just talk a bit about that timing. I've got a sense of maybe where you're going with this. Obviously, drifting has exploded over the last decade or two worldwide. But what was it specifically when you talk about timing that was so critical?
So that, in that time frame, so from like 2003 through maybe 2008, drifting came in to Norway and Europe. And there were no dedicated cars. There were, very, basic understanding of what drifting was. And my first car was an E30 with an S50 engine, like 250, 280 horsepower. And, we were running pretty shitty tires, frankly. And, it was just trying to get a grip on what was going on. And it was a time for, how to put it? Like I never had the car. I never had the car that would look good on paper. I never had a really competitive car, but I had quite a bit of racecraft from my go-karting days. And I was able to utilize that and kind of turn myself into this underdog, and having the judges maybe sway a decision in my direction because I realized what they were looking for. Does that make sense? Like, it's always easy to go with the underdog, and I kind of played that card to my advantage. Eventually got some sponsors and built a Supra back in 2008. But during all of this, you could build a car for like $10,000 and be quite competitive, and those days are long gone.
Yeah, so that was kind of the sense of what I was expecting you're going to say. We saw the same here in New Zealand when drifting first sort of really started to become popular. You could probably be reasonably competitive with a relatively low budget car, whereas those days have gone now. If you want to compete just about in any worldwide series at the top end, I'd guess if you weren't prepared to drop 100k on a car or more, you might as well not bother. The other aspect, you said that your racecraft that you sort of learned in karting. What specifically was it about the karting experience that you translated across to drifting? Obviously, it's a different type of competition, but you're door to door as well.
I want to say the most important thing is to be analytical, and in go-karting, obviously, it's the only thing that matters is the stopwatch, right? Nothing else really matters. Whereas drifting came in, and it was seemingly, a way of expressing yourself and having these different cars and the diversity with drivers. And, drifting came in and was so many different things to so many different people, and it still is today, right? From the lifestyle part of it to the all-out competitive side of it. So I was able to go into competition and look at it from a racer's point of view, where a lot of guys would come in and burn tires or whatever was fun. I would come in and see, why did we lose a battle and why did we win a battle? And that way I was able to excel from a competitive point of view. I mean, again, my cars look like trash, and and in many ways they were, but having that coming from motorsports like that, it was such a head start, against some of these other guys.
So a bit more analysis around each run and where the strengths and weaknesses were, so you could build on the strengths and maybe work on eliminating the weaknesses.
Yeah, and it's like,
okay,
if you want to succeed in something, right? It's this old saying. I don't know exactly how it goes, but you have guys that are naturally very talented, but they're so talented they don't need to work for it. And then you have guys that aren't that talented. They have to work harder, so they're going to excel and basically surpass these other guys because they're just harder workers. And I feel like there's something there.
It's an interesting point you raise. It's something I've always sort of had in the back of my mind as well. I think a lot of people think that any form of motorsport, it's sort of some kind of perhaps God-given gift, but you're of the opinion that there's those who do have that God-given gift, but even if you don't, if you want to put in the work and knuckle down, you can still excel.
Yeah, totally. So I have a lot of kids asking me and messaging me today, or over the last 5-10 years. How do I become a Pro 1 Formula Drift driver? Or how do I do this or do that? And back in the day, I would tell them, okay, I believe in, start off with this kind of chassis, practice this, do that. Now I usually just tell them, if you want it enough, and maybe this sounds cocky, but I don't mean it that way. I just tell them, if you want it enough, it's going to happen. Because if you want it enough, you're going to devote the time needed to excel. You're going to talk to people like myself and others and learn from all of them. You're going to show up at the racetrack. You're going to, learn the craft. And that was
absolutely
right. And I think success is when opportunity meets that little bit of luck. And I remember Von Gittin Jr., one of my peers in FD, he once said that you make your own luck. And I think that's a big, big thing in motorsports. Because yes,
Definitely.
It's only a fair few that get the chance to do it. But out of those, it's the guys that can basically tip the scale in their favor the most that will get that,
Yeah, I think these days a lot of people, maybe they've got a small amount of talent and they're on their way to being something big, but sitting back and waiting for you to be handed that opportunity on a plate probably doesn't work out that well for too many people, particularly now with a drifting industry that's so popular. You've got so many more people competing for just a handful of opportunities. Okay, so let's move forward. So you won the Norwegian Drift Championship, and how did you translate that to deciding to compete in the US?
So at that time, I was probably early 20s, and I was studying here in Oslo, in Norway, in college, and started working at a basically .com company, an early internet company, and in 2008, I caught word that there was going to be a world championship in the U.S. in the Port of Long Beach, put on by Formula Drift. And I had never been to the U.S. at that point. And I was a small town kid that loved drifting. And I always, I was watching Baywatch, and I was like, hell yeah, I want to go check out the States. And, how do I get to do that? And I've always been kind of opportunistic, or I've always enjoyed putting myself in situations where I don't have any idea how to do it, but maybe there's a way I can find out. And that's what happened. It was the World Championship. It would be the top 32 teams in the world that would get an invite. We were far from being good enough to do that. But I took everything I learned in school. I was studying media communications and some business stuff. So I put together a pitch, all the highlights from our small campaign here in Northern Europe, all the best photos, and basically sold our way into Formula Drift. And then I got an email back from them 2 months later that read, "Fredric, pack your bags, see you in Long Beach." And that was that invite. And all of a sudden we were among the 32 invited teams. We were there against likes of Luke Fink, Mad Mike was there, We later went on to become good friends, you know, as part of Team Speed Hunters, and I was, you know, I just remember landing in the US. We were looking for the car that we had shipped. I got lost in Compton in LA. All my buddies from back home were traveling with me. They all got lost in strip clubs in Vegas, and you know, we were just scattered all over the place. We were absolutely fresh off the boat in every way. But somehow we managed to become the best we finished as the best European team out of 7 European teams at that event, and it really lit the fire for trying to do more stuff in the US. So we left the car behind, went back to Norway, started working, and tried to come back later.
That sort of success, being, you know, placing as the top European team, was that enough to kind of get some exposure to US companies that were maybe looking at sponsorship, or did that not happen straight off the bat?
Definitely not straight off the bat. It took a long time. So after that, this was the end of 2008, went back to Europe, tried to do another round in the US the next year, got to the final round at Irvingdale, 2009, absolutely sucked and got kicked out or lost out early, and spent all of our money in the process. So that winter between 2009 and 10, my good friend Stefan, not Papadakis, but another Stefan from Norway, he moved into my parents' home here in Norway, where I still lived, and we started really studying drifting. Like, we threw down on how to we started dissecting drifting, basically, and understanding how do we win the battles? How do we actually understand the craft that is drifting? So we worked really hard that winter. We put up basically like a an ad in some of the Supra forums in the US and asked for a shop to work with. And this local shop in East LA, FSR Motorsport, they offered us basically an internship where my buddy would be wrenching on the cars. I would be selling their parts on eBay. We were sleeping together in this like crack house motel down the street and try to get ready for FD Long Beach in April 2010. And it was all really, it was that old story of this struggling actor trying to make it in LA, right?
I want people listening to really take note of that, because I think from the outside, and particularly these days, people think that they're just going to, as I said, you've got a bit of talent and maybe just going to stumble into a multi-million-dollar sponsorship deal, and that's how easy it is. And just listening to the sacrifices that you went through to get where you've got, that's the real world of actually succeeding in just about any form of motorsport, or for that matter, anything that's difficult.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it? I mean, look at the biggest companies in the world and how they started out of a garage, right? And I don't know a single successful drifter that didn't start out by maxing out their credit cards or, spending everything they got. I think sponsors even look for that. If I was on the other side of the table and I was looking at my options for sponsoring people, who do you want to work with? Of course, you want to work with the person that throws absolutely everything they have, passion. That's what they're investing in.
Yeah, I think the work ethic is so critical, as opposed to, a lot of people these days, there's a lot of entitlement, thinking that they deserve such and such, and no one really deserves anything. Right. It's as you say, it's what you make of it.
Yeah.
All right, so let's fast forward the journey a little bit. Actually, if we jump maybe more towards a bit of the modern day stuff, and back in, I think it's 2016, you won Formula D
15
using a little four-cylinder.
Yep.
15,
yep.
Sorry, with a little four-cylinder engine, which at that time was probably relatively unheard of. You're competing against much bigger capacity engines, 6 cylinders, V8s, turbos, and you're doing all of that with a small capacity 4-cylinder engine. So first of all, why did you go that path? What was it that drove the 4-cylinder engine choice?
So there's a couple of reasons why. So, in 2010, we got our breakthrough season in FD. 2011, I started working with Stefan Papadakis, who's, to this day, the team owner. And he has for starters, he has a long history of sport compact drag racing with four-bangers. Hondas, they were really pushing the bar with those four-cylinder Hondas back in like the early 2000s and even before that. So he has a natural natural interest in going against the stream and doing stuff differently. And as in the words of Steph, he would say that it's a lot easier to succeed at something when no one else is doing it, right? And at the same time, there's a lot of new tech out there that he loves, and making a four-cylinder, a 2.7 four-cylinder work in a field or an ocean of 7-liter V8s it's tricky. But at the same time, what's so cool about drifting, or one of the things that are so cool, is there's no limitations of motors. So you can use whatever fuel, you can use whatever technology you want to use. So and the grip levels are still limited. So the equalizer for all these different cars is really the tires more so than the power plants. So with that said, it's relatively easy to make these different motors work. So you have this on one side, and on the other side, we have the manufacturers, the car manufacturers like Toyota, that need to push the more basic cars, because that's their bread and butter. That's the cars that they're actually selling, and that's where marketing budgets are associated with those cars. So it's partly a marketing exercise for Toyota or Scion at the time to push these more basic cars, meeting the interest and the tech prowess of the teams in order to make that happen. So that's really where I feel like that title in 2015 was a double-sided win, because one, we won the championship, which we all want to do, and number two, we won it in a car where we did a real marketing effort for Toyota, which makes it taste a lot better. It tastes better than, and I don't mean this in the wrong way, but it tastes better than spending family money or robbing the bank. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, so on that corporate sponsorship side, swapping in a 7-liter GM LS just obviously wasn't going to fly.
Right. But
you've mentioned their power levels, and I mean, I'm not 100% sure where you were with that engine. I mean, we hear numbers thrown around 700-800 horsepower, 900, 1,000 horsepower, and while like I was a big fan of Stefan Papadakis back in the day. I sort of followed his drag racing, and that's what got me personally interested in drag racing as well. So cool. He's a very smart guy. I love watching his YouTube engine videos, and if anyone can do it, Stefan certainly can. But what I'd say is probably making power from a relatively small capacity engine. 2.7 still, it's a big 4-cylinder, but still compared to 7 litres, you've got that deficit. And turbochargers kind of are the equaliser in terms of that replacement for displacement. However, you do end up generally with a relatively narrow power band compared to that big capacity V8. You're going to be probably lacking bottom end, although you can add nitrous to the mix as well. So there's solutions to a lot of these problems, but is it fair to say you ended up with a narrower power band compared to the V8s? And did you have to drive the car differently to extract the performance out of it?
Yes. I mean, yes, it is. But I feel like it's a little more complicated than that. Because, okay, so let's say that 4-banger at the time, at that stage of development, was probably 700-800 hub horsepower. I want to say we had about 4,500 RPM of usable power band. So call it 9 or 85 to 4, 4 to 8,500 RPM. Whereas an NA, high-strung NA V8 also has a quite limited power band, right?
Sure.
Whereas if you start, supercharging or turbocharging, obviously you broaden that up, and now you introduce other issues like weight, front weight bias, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of different ways to be successful in drift with these different power plants. And usually you can drive around some of these limitations. But for sure, we definitely had a narrower power band than we wanted. That power plant is still in use in Formula Drift today with Ryan Turk in the Corolla. Whereas we've moved on to the B58 motor, the 3-liter GR Supra, the BMW Toyota partnership. And we're still running a limited displacement. We're at like 3.16 or 3.2 at this point. But we're constantly working towards broadening the power band. And we like to think we don't necessarily need power everywhere, but we need RPM so we can stretch out these sections without having to shift. There's a lot of different, technical aspects to this. Gearing is very critical. We've become more and more proficient with gearing each transmission gear individually per corner. I basically forced Steph to purchase the whole G-Force catalog of transmission gears in addition to the quick change gears. So there's a lot of Excel spreadsheets, that we work through for both suspension and car setup and motor setup in order to work around these limitations like the power band is.
All right. Well, I definitely want to talk about the transmission and final drive aspect of tuning shortly. But before we finish up with the four-banger, with such a small capacity engine producing 800 horse at the hub, so depending what sort of conversion factor you want to chuck at that, probably conservatively you've got to be around 900 flywheel. So that it's up there. What was the maintenance on those engines like, or what was their reliability like? Did it suffer because you're pushing them so damn hard?
We blew up a ton of them.
I'm pretty sure I've seen photos of the Transporter with a lineup of fresh engines sitting there waiting to be swapped in.
So it's that motor to begin with it's an eco motor. It's basically a minivan motor that we come in the Siennas and the RAV4s, and so it's not intended to be a high performance motor. Open deck. We had some weird head flex issues where some of the water like the actual cross section and some of the water section coolant sections was really thin. So Steph would drill in a stud from the top through the coolant, the passage basically to push down on the deck in between some of the cylinders. So a lot of trick and sometimes crude ways of dealing with it. But he's very methodical with working through these things. I think one of Steph's biggest strengths is that he's very good at finding people that are better at stuff than he is. So he has a lot of very knowledgeable friends that he would, work at these issues with. And eventually that motor become quite the killer. And I think Ryan's motor now makes, I want to say mid-9 to the hub, so like 950 wheel horsepower, which is pretty substantial for a car that's being run that hard. Of course, we're not running him that long, only like 30 seconds a pass, but it's pretty bitchin'.
Having said that, normally those sort of power levels from four-cylinder engines are sort of seen from drag engines, which only run for 6, 7, 8 seconds under full load. So 30 seconds is still, relatively speaking, an eternity. What I kind of want to mention just from my own, efforts with developing drag engines at kind of similar, maybe slightly higher power levels is you do tend to find weaknesses, obviously. And if you are persevering with the same platform season after season, you see these weaknesses come up, you can work around solutions. And again, Steph's obviously a pretty smart cookie, as you say, surrounds himself with even smarter people. So you can iron out these bugs, and over time, it might not happen straight away, but it is possible to get a relatively reliable solution, even if you still maybe need to take a couple of spare engines along to the track each weekend. But that it is what it is. Now, one of the things though, I'm interested is the advantages as you see it in the small capacity engine. I'm assuming even when you hang a turbocharger off the side of it, there's got to be a weight advantage, and that's sitting right over the front axle line. So how does that transpire compared to like a 7-litre V8 maybe with a supercharger on it?
I don't have the actual weight numbers here, but the four-banger is quite light, and even with the manifold and the turbo, it's lighter than the lightest LS setups. And for that particular, for the Corollas and the Scion TCs, the firewall to front axle distance is quite short. So basically, I want to say, for a V8 or a four-banger, probably 70% of the motor would be in front of the axle. So that's a big advantage for sure. But that's, for a more, call it a more normal car like the GR Supra, that's less of an issue. And so it's more, and you can also argue whether that front weight bias is really an issue or not. Because we generate a lot of the grip these days with mechanical ways, so we can probably get by with a little more front weight bias. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Corolla setup is the ideal perfect car overall. There's some good benefits to the rear trailing arm setup and stuff like that, but we're starting to see now in drifting that we're moving towards traditional strong race car chassis setups, right? With maybe double A-arm front end, more of the Corvette looking cars, or the GR Supra with the really low center of gravity. So more and more of that stuff is becoming prevalent.
That segues quite nicely into the next question I had, which is around those chassis. So obviously you've mentioned you've got the sponsorship deal with Scion, and then obviously that translated over to Toyota. So you started with the Scion TC, then the Toyota Corolla. We're talking about basically an entry-level Econobox daily driver front-wheel drive chassis that on paper it looks like it's about as wide as it is long. And for me, as a non-drifter, that doesn't look like the ideal solution for a drift chassis if you had a clean sheet of paper and you are just picking the best of the best. What challenges does that give you? I mean, obviously you have to convert the chassis for a start from front-wheel drive to rear-wheel drive, but particularly the wheelbase to track, is that a problem, or am I kind of overanalyzing that?
So the Corolla actually has a quite long wheelbase. So the current Corolla that Ryan's in and that I was in 2018 is a 105-inch wheelbase, whereas the GR Supra is like 95. So
wow, deceptive.
Yeah, right. So I think what it is you see a hatchback and you think it's a small car, but as you know, every generation of car will grow except the GR Supra, which actually shrunk. So it's like you said, it's very deceptive, and you'll see it when the two cars are lined up at the start. Like the Mustang and the Corolla lined up together makes the Corolla look big when you actually see them.
Right.
So wheelbase is important, and it looks to be kind of like an ideal sweet spot of mid 100-inch, like 105 is probably quite ideal all round. Some other benefits to the Corolla is that rear trailing arm setup, which makes it, you basically adjust squat and anti-squat with ride height. It has some good corner exit properties that seem to work well in drift. It's relatively easy to set up, and a lot of front-wheel drive cars will have these weird torsion style rear axles, right? Luckily, that generation of the Corolla does it. So it actually has a rear suspension that lends itself nicely to drift. The biggest downside is Well, there's a couple. Is firewall to front axle clearance for weight bias. That's one. But the biggest one is probably center of gravity. So what we started seeing with the Corolla is that we would, no matter what we did, we would start wearing the outside tire more. It was hard to really run the car soft and at the same time prevent roll. You start running into these issues where you just can't compare to a GT86 or a Corvette or the GR Supra.
Now, it's interesting you just mentioned the GT86. That ZN6 chassis was obviously available when you were competing in the Scion TC and the Toyota Corolla. So, I mean, on paper, just from a layman's perspective, I look at the GT86 and I look at the work involved in converting a front-wheel drive Corolla to a competitive drift car, and I'm thinking, surely the GT86 just makes more sense all round.
Yeah.
Is that just driven by Toyota's marketing campaign? They wanted to put money behind the Corolla /TC, or is there something else I'm not aware of there?
I think that's it. That's really it. And of course, there are many, opinions and meetings and discussions and strategies and ways of thinking about this. But if you really break down the Toyota team, even today in FD, you have. If you start with the drivers, you have Ken Gushi, who's a Japanese-American OG drifter. You have Ryan Turk, hailing from the East Coast of the U.S., white boy. You have myself, who's this kind of weird, European dude. And we have Jonathan Castro from the Dominican Republic. So it's a very diverse team of drivers, right? And if you...
Definitely.
Right? And the same goes for the cars. I mean, if I was the chief executive at Toyota, I think it'd be really cool to have all these different cars in the sport and kind of have them bounce off of each other and take on different opponents. And so I think if drifting was about diversity when it started coming around, I think Toyota's just added to that by having these different cars be in the show. And and that way they have a lot more freedom to market these different cars, and there's a bigger story there, right? At the end of the day, I think the function that motorsports play for manufacturers is that story, and I think they've done a good job of dealing with that by having these different cars in the sport.
I mean, obviously, the young guys and girls watching, maybe initially don't have budget for a brand new Supra, but as you say, the Corolla maybe looks like a more affordable option. I'm assuming most of them are probably smart enough to know that off the showroom floor, they're probably not going to make the ideal drift car, but still, you've got the look and feel of what they're seeing in FD. So yeah, I can get that from Toyota's perspective. Maybe you're right; it does make a lot of sense. Now, we've talked a little bit so far about power levels. I just want to dive into that a little bit more. Drifting really hails back from Japan many decades ago, and when drifting was sort of not maybe as popular around the rest of the world, over in Japan, you were seeing power levels of maybe 350, 450 horsepower, and probably not maybe too much more than that. These days, power levels of 800, 900, 1,000 horsepower are more the norm, and I don't think you'd probably see too many naturally aspirated AE86s competing with the best of the best these days, which is, in my opinion, a hell of a shame, actually. Right. I love those cars. But what's driven the power levels to get where they are? What's changed in drifting where decades ago 400 horsepower was plenty, and now that wouldn't even have you anywhere near being competitive? Right.
There's really one major answer to that, or one main answer, and that is grip. It's a judged sport, meaning that there's not really a stopwatch, but there is a visual speed, meaning by how much can you gap the chase car, or as a chase car, how well can you keep up with the lead car? So speed is very much a deciding factor in the sport. In certain series, they still use speed guns. speed and basically your timed lap per se is still quite important. And that's pushed, teams to look for better tires, tire manufacturers to make better tires. It's pushed FD into creating what I think is probably the best rule set for drifting series globally, because FD has been able to keep the performance of all these different tires in check, whereas a lot of the other series around the world, Russia, Japan, even with D1, China, it's kind of an arms race now where manufacturers can show up with any tire. So it's really all out slick tires with kind of a street, tread, cut out of them. So that's basically what's pushed the power levels to where they are, because as drivers, we don't really care about numbers. We don't care what the power level is. What we care about is having enough power to overcome the grip. And the way we talk about it in our team is all these different aspects of the car. We talk about having margin. We talk about having enough steering angle to overcome any kind of half spin, overcome lead car checking up, basically overcome whatever gets thrown at you. And that goes for braking capability as well, being able to brake harder than lead car if he ends up slowing down faster than you. And it comes down to power as well, having the ability to power out of any situation. Let's say you're in a gear too heavy, whatever happens, So at the end of the day, it's just about having enough of all these different tools so that you have the higher chance of putting a good rundown.
So it's been an iterative development, sort of reading between the lines there. Tyre technology's improved, so therefore grip improves, which allows more power to be put to the track. So power levels increase, and then we go through this constant iteration of improvements. And I think probably, I'd imagine anyone listening to this podcast has probably watched drifting. Obviously, it's definitely nothing new at this point. But I think what is easy to overlook from a layman's perspective is essentially it starts with a drag race, because when you're on that chase run, if the car in front of you manages to pull out a massive gap, that's going to be very hard for you to make up during the judge section. Is that correct?
100%.
So you want to be able to match that car in front with acceleration.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's kind of a grudge match too, because especially in FD, or at least in FD, we have a rolling start. So it's kind of like this tit for tat, or this rolling. It's kind of a rolling start where you're gauging these other cars, and then the actual launch happens after the start chicane.
Now, most people probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to ride in a competitive drift car, so the actual power, the acceleration, etc., is probably a little difficult to gauge by watching. I don't even know if you've got numbers here, but just so we could kind of break it down to sort of something that's maybe a little bit more understandable. Could you give us maybe a 0 to 60 mile an hour or a quarter mile time that a current winning FD car could lay down?
Do you guys go by kilometers or miles per hour in New Zealand?
Here in New Zealand, we use kilometres an hour, so I'm 0 to 100, but we have an international market, and I know a lot of people struggle. So 0 to 60, 0 to 100, for me, it's pretty much the same thing.
Okay. So the 0 to 60 won't be great because we're not hooking up, we're not on drag radials, right? And suspension is not set up for drag. But if we go back to kilometers per hour, but from like 100 kilometers an hour to 250, these cars are pretty freaking fast. And in order to kind of explain what it feels like, I had the opportunity to precision drive, stunt drive a Koenigsegg CCXR for a movie. That thing pulls like a bag of... It felt like trash compared to a pro FD car. These FD pro drift cars, I mean... The car that we're running in FD today puts down 1150 to the ground with nitrous setup. At the same time, it's super civilized. You could drive it to the store, no problem. It's all the ergonomics, everything is super dandy. It's just very explosive when you need it. And it's super light. It's dedicated to what we're doing. Imagine you're going down the freeway in New Zealand and you're going 100, what's the speed limit? 100K, 120?
100K.
100K.
Yeah, 100K.
Double that. You're traveling down the freeway 200K, maybe 250K, right? And then you're like, okay, I'm hungry. I'm going to turn off this intersection, this junction here. You're going 250, top of 6th, and you do a Scandinavian flick. You're on the e-brake, clutch in, going 250. You're steering off the intersection. You're dropping a couple of gears into the next roundabout. You jump over the roundabout, load the car up, still sliding, pop another gears down, and then you slide into McDonald's drive-thru. That's really what it is. And, most people wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't do that in a street car, but I'd do it any day in a pro drift car because that's what they're meant to do.
Sure. Yeah. Don't ever try that on the New Zealand motorways. If you do end up here, just a pro tip. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing at an event in order to optimize the car and get the most out of it, because I can imagine it's like any form of motorsport. You don't just unload the car from the trailer, go through your practice rounds and into competition, and then load back up and go home without making changes. I assume you are making tweaks run to optimize the car to the track, to the conditions, etc.
Absolutely. So it starts with the track. Is this a track we've been to before, or is it a brand new track? So let's say it's a brand new track. We will then make our best educated guess / analysis on where to start with alignment and turbo size and gearing, tire pressure perhaps, and I think those are the main factors. So we will look at the size of the track. We will look at whether, and one of the cool things about drift is that it's usually only 3-4 corners. So it's relatively easy to get a decent understanding of what you need for each individual corner. So we'll start there. We'll set up the final gear ratio, the trans gears, what we think we're going to need for each individual corner, and kind of the best compromise between all of them. In reality, we end up running quite a bit of asymmetric alignments. So we run, obviously different toe, different camber, sometimes different dynamic suspension setups as well. We run a lot of wedge.
So you're talking asymmetric side to side changes. Yep. Okay.
We run a lot of wedge often, where we crossway the car. It's basically it's diagonally out of balance, kind of a NASCAR style setup. Tire pressures are very often, different left to right. So we start off there with our best judgment. And in FD, we have very limited track time. So we get 12 runs pre-qualifying. So, but we still have enough time to do those 12 runs to where we can usually make certain changes in between. But it's a very analytical process for us, where we're very, meticulous with how we go about it. And comp day and practice day isn't really the time to focus on, oh, it's so much fun to drive. This is very much you're there to do a job. Exactly. It doesn't mean we don't like it. And I personally love that nitty-gritty, nerdy side of it. And I think that's why I've survived in this sport, is because I am that setup nerd and that car nerd that loves doing those things.
Now, you've just mentioned a bunch of terms there. I kind of want to go back and unpack a few of them. And that one that you mentioned, wedge, I just want to dive into that a little bit, because probably some of the listeners might not understand that. So one of the tools we have at our disposal, regardless if we're setting up a road race car or a drift car, is corner weighting the car. And at least from my perspective, for road race applications, most often what we're trying to do is get our cross weights to be 50-50, which means if we add up the weight on the front right corner and the left rear corner, the total of that, ideally we want to be 50% of the overall weight of the car. And the reason we do that is because if we get that cross weight to be 50-50, the car should, all things being equal, handle and feel the same in a left-hand corner compared to a right-hand corner. Now, you mentioned NASCAR, and obviously they go fast and they turn left, so they don't really care how well the car turns to the right. So they use this wedge, which is where you're purposely offsetting that, so you're not aiming for a 50% cross weight. You mentioned you're doing the same or similar in the drift cars. So am I right in saying this is to suit a track or a layout that's predominantly maybe more right-hand corners than left-hand, or vice versa?
It is, yes, you're right in assuming that. And at the same time, it's often more skewed too, where we're on let's say a banked oval, where the main or the first corner is up on the high, the outer bank, and then we go into the infield, which is off camber. And then we're into the second bank, which has a little bit of camber, right? So what we're really doing is taking away mechanical grip on that big bank to where the car can often feel too tight. You can feel like you have too much grip, and you get it back where you need it the most, right? And then we take a little more grip back out of the car in that next left-hander. So what it really is removing grip, either front or rear grip, in going left and adding it going right, or vice versa. And going back to what you said about crossweighing the car to where it's even or balanced, I'm a firm believer that a lot of that is our OCD kicking in, right? I think even if you're road racing, usually the corner is a lap, right? Meaning that there's usually more corners going left than there is going right. So I think there are a lot of benefits even to the club racer or novice with playing around with these different setups.
100%.
And maybe there's one really tricky corner on that road race course where you could really benefit from taking away some push, So I think a lot of people, even coming up through the ranks, are listening too much to what's right per the book, as opposed to trying these different setups for themselves and learning from it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important to actually dedicate some time to making specific changes and then actually going out and getting a sense from the driver's seat. Well, what did that feel like? What did it actually do, as opposed to what the textbook says it should do? And building up that understanding for yourself of what these changes feel like, and that knowledge over time, then you get to a certain track, you're going to have an understanding of, from your experience, okay, I think we want to try this, and this. That should set us up. Which leads me to my next question. With limited track time and such a vast array of potential adjustability in the suspension of your cars, what are you using to help guide you with what change to make from one session to another? Have you got data analysis techniques that you're using, or is it seat of the pants and experience primarily?
So both. Obviously, this is where experience comes into play, right? Like, I've been lucky enough to now travel the world and drive tons of different cars, and in different series, and so all of that experience plays into this. At the same time, we're using data and more of it. We've run a special sensor in the car this year where we're not just logging yaw and GPS and Gs, but we're also logging, what do you call that direction? Is that the Z-axis?
Vertical, heave, vertical axis, Z-axis. Yep.
So we're playing around with all these different things, and we end up using a lot of video for analysis as well, because it's judged. Obviously, the more you can see what's going on, the only thing that really matters to us is what the judges see. So that's why we try and really study and look at video from the judge's angle. So it's really coming down to using whatever tools are available, but also not getting lost in the info stream, because you can definitely end up going down the rabbit hole of hyper-focusing on something that at the end of the day isn't the most crucial. So we're always trying to find that balance, right? Between really trying to learn something new without losing track of the overall picture of what's going on.
Yeah, fair. All right, so you've mentioned gearing and the final drives and how you're making changes to those. Now, obviously, the Winters quick change rear end is been sort of a staple for any pro drift car for a fair while now. So that allows you to change your overall gearing up and down to suit whether the track is high speed, low speed, whatever. So you can keep the engine in the power band. Changing individual ratios in the transmission is sort of taking that to another level. So what are you trying to do there? Are you trying to sort of gear everything so that you are just within a specific power band? How many gear changes are you trying to make? Talk us through the thought process there.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that we are trying to achieve. One is shifting the least amount of times possible. And my good friend Mad Mike, it's so cool seeing Mike drive because he's such a different school than I am, way more flamboyant, and it's almost like Mike wants to shift as many times as possible, and it's freaking awesome, right? And I love that about him, but at the same time, it's opening a can of worms every time you shift, right? So it's cool to see how drifting can be so many different things, and you can do it so many different ways. But for us, it's about limiting the amount of times we have to shift. Number 2 is conserving tires, because we want to make sure it's a fine balance between making the run look exciting and at the same time saving tire and therefore grip, reducing the pressure growth and of the tires. So it's that balance, and at the same time, and probably perhaps some of the most important, is being able to get the best feeding in the power on corner exit, so we can get the best drive out of the corners that we can possibly do, especially in the wet, or if it's a really slippery corner, we will really try and modulate and feed in the throttle and half slip the clutch to get the drive out of these corners. And the lighter the gear you can run there, the better it is. But then you run the risk of revving out too early to where you barely make it before the next corner without straightening out. So it's that balance between those three factors.
Okay. Now, and you've mentioned the tire and how the tires have evolved to the point you're getting so much more grip these days. You also mentioned, just in passing, that you believe FD's got a really good rule set there. Is that around, well, particularly you mentioned the tire there, is that around making sure that one manufacturer of tires doesn't have just such a runaway advantage over the others? And if that's the case, so what are they doing to sort of equalize the tire performance across all the different brands?
Yeah, so I think what it starts with is making sure that we have a multitude of different tire manufacturers that wants to be involved and have the ability to be involved, and by being involved can support the different teams. So in FD today, the tire manufacturers are probably the biggest monetary contributors to the teams, which is awesome, right? So now if you compare that to these lawless series where it's essentially 1 or 2 tires you have to be on in order to win. And now people that are sponsored by other tires even are buying these other tires, under the table and running them in competition. So kind of not doing what FD is doing kind of undermines the whole viable business aspect of the series, I think. So it's that, and at the same time, limiting the grip a little bit will make clutches, transmissions, drivetrains, motors last a hell of a lot longer. And, in D1 now, you're seeing a lot of photos of snapped input shafts and axles, and it's a race to the bottom. I mean, it's amazing. It's the more grip, the more fun it is to drive. I mean, it gets trickier at some point, but it's just chews through parts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that's no one really wants to go to a track and spend the whole weekend wrenching on the car because you're busting parts left, right, and centre. So it is a challenge, and you get to these power levels and grip levels where even the best parts that money can buy, they still break. So it's a challenge. you mentioned pressure growth with the tire as well. So this is something that we have to deal with in just about any form of motorsport. Obviously, the tire has a sweet spot in terms of pressure where you're optimizing the tire contact patch. Overinflated, and basically the tire balloons out and your contact patch shrinks to the middle of the tire. Underinflate, it's running on the outside edges. So, with drifting, I'm guessing there's another challenge in there because you've got so much wheel spin, which is obviously putting huge amounts of heat into the rear tires, and you have to do 2 laps on these tires.
Yep.
So how do you underinflate for your first lap so that you're not massively overinflated for the second lap? Where's the compromise come there? How are you kind of doing that?
Yeah, that always a challenge because obviously with the lower tire pressure, depending how low you actually go, you get more grip, obviously, with the lower pressure. Now, if you qualify high, you have to lead first, and that too much grip will make the car a little hard to drive. Whereas, so where I'm going with this is sometimes you'd want to chase first with a slightly grippier car in chase, because you can get away with a little less angle and not pushing it out to the outer zones in that first run. And now you have a slightly looser car for the second run, which is now your lead. So those are some of the things that we're trying to fight. But because at the same time, we also want to qualify high because you have a higher chance of facing an easier opponent. I mean, no opponent's easy, but there's some of that going on. It's very track dependent, how much grip can we pull off in a lead run. Sometimes we have to make sure we don't get too greedy with dropping pressures too far, both from a drivability point of view as well as a risk of debeating point of view. It's dependent on who we're facing, their expected speed or pace through the course. And, there's no secret that in FD, for most tracks, we're down in the low, the single digits, in terms of PSI. Half a bar, 6-7 PSI.
Wow.
Quite low.
Yeah, that's incredibly low.
And what we're trying to do is obviously maximize that contact patch, like you were saying. So we're running the Nitto G2s, a 315, 4018, huge tire with a massive sidewall at half a bar. Imagine that contact patch. These cars have a lot of understeer if you were to race them, not drifting. So there's quite a bit of rear grip.
So the way of overcoming that understeer is to break the rear loose.
Yep. But at the same time, through a long, medium to low angle corner, you're still going to experience that understeer. And that's, again, where we're trying to balance, the pros and cons of running a lot of rear grip. Right now we're in the process of trying to find more front grip, but now you're running into packaging issues with running a big tire because you don't have wheel well space for them at lock, availability. So there's like uniform racing, it's always
a compromise.
And we're just trying to raise that compromise.
I just want to talk briefly about the Supra, the A90 GR Supra chassis. So you kind of alluded to some of the aspects of that already, the lower center of gravity. But in terms of the transition from the likes of the front wheel drive Toyota Corolla with the 4-cylinder converted rear wheel drive versus the Supra, can you give us the pros of the Supra and maybe if there are any downsides, the cons as well?
Yep. Pros, low center of gravity is by far the biggest one. It allows you to run us off the car, put more weight in that inner rear. You basically, in short, you get a much nicer handling car for the grip level we're running. There's a couple of downsides. Short wheelbase makes it a little twitchy, not as stable as probably a longer wheelbase one. Low or short overhang in the rear gives you less margin for a wall ride or, a wall hit if you compare that to a Mustang or, the Ute that my friend Josh Robinson is running, which has probably a meter of overhang. Another issue is the way the rules are written. You're not allowed to push the shock towers out for beyond the bolt circle or the PCD of the shock tower. So in order to make the front suspension of a narrow McPherson car work, you end up with a lot of kingpin inclination. So basically, you're a lot of compromise in the front end, where we run a lot of static camber, but as we start turning, that outer tire starts leaning a lot. So you only really have a flat contact patch at probably half of your lock cycle. And that is somewhat of an issue for drivability in front grip. But manageable.
You mentioned the power levels you're running at the moment around that 1150. That was 1150 to the hub?
Yes, to the ground on a Mustang roller.
Okay, a Mustang roller. So where do you sort of see the limit there? Is that a happy place, or is there more progress to come in time with that? Would you happily have another 100 or 200 horsepower if it was on offer?
I think for the track, we're at the limit at certain tracks, like at Irwindale and Seattle. We were fine last year. But I think moving forward, grip levels are only going to go up. And the bigger issue here is drivability. So we go through quite a few clutches. Probably, we're running quads, so I probably go through like 40 discs a year for the 8 rounds. And we start burning through a lot of clutches where there's a lot of e-brake pulls in heavy gears and back on and feeding the throttle back in. We just put so much heat through the clutch that a bigger motor where you could get away with better drivability off the clutch would probably save the clutches more.
Right.
So I think I'm starting, or not starting to, but I think the ideal drift motor is probably a bigger displacement, but retaining some of that weight. So I personally think, speaking out loudly, like a 1UZ, 2UZ, 3UZ is probably still a great power plant from the Toyota family. Obviously there's some other motors in that realm from other manufacturers, but like a compact, lightweight V6 or V8 with a single or twin installation where you're able to keep the weight low is shaping up to be the leading platform. With that said, though, the B58 is pretty mind-blowing for what it is. It far exceeds any 2J that I've run, and the weight on top of it, they're really light.
Yeah, the 2J is a great engine, but when you're dealing with a cast iron block, there's a lot of inherent weight that's difficult to get rid of. And I haven't dealt with one personally, but that BMW engine seems to have exceeded everyone's expectations.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of drifting as a sport, one of the comments that comes up from time to time is arguments over the fact it is ultimately a judged sport, which is fairly unique for motorsport. Normally, we're racing against the stopwatch, and the stopwatch really doesn't lie. So with drifting, you have judges basically giving you scores, and anytime there's a human element that comes into that, it gets a little bit questionable from time to time, and obviously not everyone's going to agree with the judges' calls. Do you expect in the future of drifting we're going to see technology come in to maybe take that human element out of the judging?
Totally. Maybe not take the human element out entirely, but at least help support the judging and perhaps even support the fans' perception of what's going on. As a competitor today, I want to say I probably agree with 90% of the calls.
Sure. And
can understand 90% of the calls, but that means there's still 10% of the calls that I don't necessarily agree with. And I think that's a pretty good ratio, but if I'm not at 100%, I can only envision what it's like for the casual fan, right? And it is hard to understand at times, and the more technical it gets, the more difficult it can become too. So it's a balance there between having data to rely on without it making it more challenging to understand what's going on. So that's a constant debate in drifting, is how do we make a rule set that's easy for everyone to understand? How do we stick to that rule set? How do we use data in the best way possible? But it's coming. FD's talking about proximity sensors. They're talking about in-car cameras. They're already pulling data from our ECUs to see if there's a lift or not. Obviously, again, Mike and the drift shifters set up where they use proximity sensors around the courses. There's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately human decisions will be a part of drifting. And I mean, look at F1. Look at the last, it's...
It's a great point.
So it's...
Yeah, certainly no one could argue human judgment didn't come into play with Max Verstappen's championship, which is unfortunate for him. Sort of won a championship under a bit of a cloud, really. Yeah,
but it's always going to be some... It's the same in soccer, right? It's always going to be the powers that be having some kind of effect on what's going on. And I think that's the black art of sports. It's really understanding how do you put yourself in that favorable position and capitalize on it when you can. That's at least as a competitor, that's all we can do.
Absolutely. In terms of other developments that you kind of see on the horizon for drifting, if you looked into your crystal ball in the next 10 years, what do you see coming into Formula D?
I'd love to see someone do a new take on an electric vehicle. We had a Tesla powertrain powered, Camaro a couple years back, which didn't really work that well. But I think if you did it in a more conventional layout where you just replace the motor but keep the drivetrain, where you actually run the motor through a clutch and a trans, it'd be a better setup. I would love to see that, to stay in tune with what's going on elsewhere in the world. Other than that, I think it's just going to keep develop. We're going to keep making more and more grip, more and more power. I think it'd be cool to explore something that was very different, more in tune with pop culture, maybe more. I've been a big proponent for drift shifters. I'd love to be a part of a World Series where we go to these iconic areas and downtowns and cities and beaches and stuff like that, and where there's more focus on the sport and the precision, more so than perhaps the tire smoke, because I think that's something that we may face and need in order to keep the sport that we love going.
All right, Fredric, we're probably getting a little bit long here, and I want to respect your time, so we'll wrap things up. What's next on the radar for you? Winningest driver, I think. Is there a point where enough's enough? Is retirement on the cards, or are you still as driven and passionate about drifting as you've always been?
I am definitely as passionate about it, but in different ways. As I've gone through the ranks, it's different things that start attracting me more, and I still really love the nerdy, nitty-gritty moments of a race weekend. But at the same time, I'm starting to look around, and maybe one day I could help bring up some other, aspiring drifter, maybe a girl, something new. I'd love to be on that side of the table, and maybe, providing some help to the next up and coming driver.
Certainly, mentorship from someone of your standing in the drift community would be really powerful. So it'd be exciting to see. On that same note, really, the next question: if you were to sort of take all of your experience over your career, package that up, and be able to give some advice to a younger version of yourself just wanting to get started, maybe following a career as a professional drifter, or for that matter, any form of professional motorsport, what advice would you give to yourself to fast track that career?
Follow your gut, and don't don't take what everyone else says for gospel. I think having a strong bullshit filter and really trusting your own analysis and your own way of doing it, I think it's something that I've always done, but it's something that I see in hindsight that has really helped me. Doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to other people, but definitely spend your own time really understanding what's going on. And competitors definitely, they will tell you a lot of things, but maybe not, they won't tell you the core of what's actually winning. And you kind of got to go out there and learn that for yourself. So just, if you're out there and you're an aspiring driver, drifter, or crew member, just dive into it and you'll find your way and be out there, talk to people. But at the end of the day, trust your own gut feeling with whatever you're doing and you'll be just fine.
Perfect. All right, last question for today, Fredric. If people are interested in following you, checking out your journey, how are they best to do so?
Maybe, what's that new app, Grindr?
Really? Okay, did not see that one coming.
I'm happily married to my wife, and so probably not Grindr, at least not officially. But
perfect.
But Instagram, my name, Fredric Aasbø. I'm on Facebook. I have a YouTube, not very good at it. I'm on TikTok now. But I think Instagram's where the action is. We're ramping up over here for ice drifting, which is probably the most fun I have behind the wheel of a race car. We're in these 200 horsepower basic Supras and Dimmers and ISs and Altezas, and it's amazing. And it's kind of like a spec class where we all run NA straight sixes, but we're all looking for these little cheats here and there. So I'm just rebuilding mine with my buddy, and a little bit more compression, different tune, some tricks in the spec, love it. So the frozen lakes here are now starting to really look good, and it's cold enough and ready to go have some fun on the lake.
Sounds exciting. All right, Fredric, thanks heaps for your time, and really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing your endeavors over the next little while. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.